Kelly, thanks for joining us today on 10 Across Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
Delighted to do it. So heat is in the news a lot lately, and we're going to talk about all aspects of that topic. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about how you arrived at an interest in it and the work that you're doing. If I understand it, you started out in the Massachusetts legislature helping out, and so you saw government, at least at the state scale. Tell us how you went from there to a degree in planning to the kind of policy research work that you're doing now around heat.
Yeah, sure. So I did my undergraduate at Wellesley College. I had in my mind that I would go where Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright went, and I would have a career in politics. And I interned in DC for Ted Kennedy, and I interned in the Massachusetts legislature and parlayed that in my first job. And it turned out that really wasn't my calling.
What was it about it that you saw that made that obvious to you?
Well, I was very interested in substantively diving into topics in a really robust way. And I was doing a lot more of strategy, which it's interesting. At that time in my life, that wasn't interesting to me, to be strategizing around elections and policies. But anyway, before I did that, I had conducted an honors thesis at Wellesley on the Healthy Forest Restoration Act under the second Bush. And it was through that process, I started reading. I loved doing the research, and I discovered urban sprawl and the problems that urban sprawl was causing for the Southwest, particularly at the urban wildlife interface around drought and water scarcity. And so I decided to apply to graduate school. So I cold emailed faculty from all different disciplines. It didn't matter if it was political science, which my degree was, or something else. And I got a lovely email back from the person who would become my advisor, Pat Gober at ASU, saying, it really sounds like you need to come to Arizona State University. You need to do a PhD in geography, and you should apply for this thing we have called the IGERT in urban ecology, which is an interdisciplinary fellow program where you'll be with a bunch of like-minded people who don't see issues from any particular disciplinary lens. And so that's how I got away from politics and into environment.
So you saw government, you went through policy, and now you have become something of an expert in heat. But obviously you think about the built environment as a planner, as a geographer. Heat has become a matter, obviously a real concern in the 10 Across geography. These are the hottest states, the hottest cities. The number of people who are being impacted negatively continues to grow. Which aspects of heat, because there is the human dimension, there's agriculture, there's how the materials that we use to build things, and obviously with your background, you probably think about that. What are the aspects of heat that are of most interest to you?
Yeah, well, so again, somebody from an interdisciplinary background, one of the things that we're taught is that anytime you ask a question about something, you start to frame a certain set of solutions. And so kind of skimming back to the object, or the object here being heat, is the best way to do it because you can pass through it in any direction. But I would say that for me, the most interesting things are where there's logic that when what's actually good defies common sense logic, when there's a complexity that needs to be revealed and can change and upend how we think about planning for heat. Those are the issues that are most exciting to me. So
that's a really interesting comment. What do you mean? What's good defies the obvious logic? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So a great example, this is some collaboration that I've done around urban heat and reflective surfaces. And so, for a long time, the way I got into heat, the way a lot of people get into heat, is looking at satellite images. And you see these really compelling images that show hotspots in cities. And cities look like what we call now the urban heat island. There are these hotspots that pop up. But what people experience on the ground is not what the satellites necessarily see. And so we're planning and we're creating policies for what we see, the skin temperature of the Earth from a satellite view. But what will actually cool people's bodies requires us to go down on the ground and to look at other factors. And so it just happens that there's certain sort of solutions like tinkering around with surfaces that aren't super effective at cooling bodies, where they are more effective at that sort of regional scale.
And you may be referencing some things that we've done here in Phoenix. And I think there's been experiments in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Let's think about some massive services like roadways. And it might make sense whenever you cross a parking lot in this area of the country. Today it's about 110. You feel that black asphalt absorbing that heat. You feel it radiating up back to you. And the thought might be, well, maybe a black asphalt service isn't the best one for managing heat. I think what you've discovered is this is maybe that counterintuitive aspect you brought up. Tell us about some of the work that might have revealed why there seems to be a logical approach to that may not be the best approach.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would never advocate that asphalt's the best surface material ever for managing heat. I think that's something intuitive and logical and bears out in the science. However, so some of the work that we've done, basically, if you take heat and stop thinking of it as a noun, in fact, the American Meteorological Society says, let's not talk about it as a noun, because it is a verb. It is a process of energy transfer. And so the reason that asphalt kind of pops up in these heat island assessments as being the culprit is because it holds that heat and slowly re-radiates it. And when you put in a cool surface, what you do is you don't destroy that heat, because that energy can't be destroyed. It can only be transferred. You change that transfer process. And so what happens is, rather than holding onto the heat and re-radiating it slowly and causing a 3 p.m., 4, 5 p.m. heating, you're just getting it right away. That energy is radiating back at people's bodies if they're standing there more immediately. So what Phoenix did and what LA did, and I did do some work in the city of LA on this, is actually really, really smart. One of the biggest challenges in any sort of climate adaptation that involves public infrastructure is ownership. We have a patchwork of hundreds of thousands of tiny parcels in cities that are owned by all different people, and usually privately owned. And so when you have a massive public piece of land, like a street, and you know that the asphalt is not the most desirable in terms of a heat outcome, it is actually a really innovative idea, I think, to say, like, hey, let's convert all these streets to a reflective coating or something that's cooler, from a logistics perspective and from a science perspective. The problem is that we also have to consider how space is used. So if we know that, reflective coatings can help cool the surface temperature, but we know that they change when that energy transfer occurs, then a more nuanced take is, okay, who's going to be using this space when and how? So a street, maybe we're less concerned because a lot of people aren't walking down the middle of major thoroughfares, or they shouldn't be. That's very dangerous for other reasons. But if you're thinking about a place like a playground, then you might be concerned about that energy transfer during the middle of the day.
This gets to the heart of some of what we do at 10 Across, which is comparing, I say this all the time, to the experience of someone on the ground in a place, what they're feeling, and how the data, in this case you mentioned satellite data, confirms that and suggests also some trend lines, which if you can see a trend line, then therefore you probably ought to have a sense of action to respond to that in one way or another. So I think your example is a real good one, a very meaningful sense of what it means to be a pedestrian, and then what data is telling you ought to do as an urbanist, or maybe as a mayor or city council or someone managing streets. So you received a grant in 2021 to look at how to make LA a bit more heat resilient. So tell us about that work, because I think what was in that work was not only dealing with heat, but other things come up, like
Mhm.
water and
Mhm.
other related topics. It
Mhm.
seemed like that grant had some multiple
Mhm.
facets to it that allowed you to examine heat and
Mhm.
related
Mhm.
issues. Is that fair?
Mhm. Yeah, so that was a Catalyst grant, and it was a competition that I entered with a bunch of faculty from across campus. So it was a group including material sciences, somebody from
Mhm.
law. It was very, very interdisciplinary. And yeah, one of the most interesting things I think to come out of that is we started using cell phone mobility data to look at where
Hmm.
people go when. And then I had at that point I had started work on mapping shade. So this is the
Mhm.
solution that I've really like dug into since then. But this was my first foray into really, really addressing shade. And what we asked as a simple question is if it's really hot outside, do people change where they're going, their routes to be in the shade? And what we found is not really.
Mhm.
Which so during the work week, it turns out that people just need to kind of go where they need to kind of go, and
Mhm.
they're going to take that route. During the weekends, there's a little bit more flexibility, and there's a couple conclusions for planning that can be drawn from that. I mean, one is that we need to bring cooling to the people, not expect people go to the cooling, but also that people probably don't have a full awareness of exactly how much cooling they're getting from shade. Because I
Hmm.
think we all intuitively know, if it's hot outside, we can all imagine a time when we ducked under the tree to get some shade. But understanding exactly how much thermal safety that's buying your body,
Hmm.
that's something we're just starting to be able to communicate.
Well, there is absolutely no doubt, including myself just today, standing at a busy intersection with plenty
Mhm,
of concrete and asphalt,
mhm,
that when you come to a stop, you stand behind that telephone pole
mhm,
or whatever it is to provide you some shade in a place where the heat and the sunlight is obviously quite powerful. There's an interesting discussion around shade and trees, which
mhm,
we've examined at length here in the
mhm,
Phoenix area. Obviously, trees can be great providers of shade, but they
mhm,
need to be nurtured, they need to be cared for, they need to be watered, and
mhm,
some trees are far more effective than others. You speak to the planting of many thousands of palm trees in LA at a certain point.
mhm,
And obviously, they're pretty spectacular and they give LA its look, if
mhm.
you will,
Right.
but they're very poor at shade. But trees seem to be the antidote for a lot of people
Mhm,
with
mhm.
regard to shade and the producing of cooling areas. Tell us about your take with trees.
Yeah. Okay. So, um, I think one of the reasons that trees are so popular is they have all these myriad co-benefits that get kind of locked on, and cities have a history of having urban forestry programs, and so it just seems intuitively good to plant trees. But there have been some great publications coming out talking about exactly what you're talking about, that they ruin sidewalks, that they require lots of water, they have kind of conflicts with telephone poles, right? And not every tree is created equal. Um, so trees aren't always the best solution for every site. This is why we advocate for considering shade infrastructure. That's
Hmm.
all of the built. So it's a really simple idea that what is shade? It's blocking the sun, and any
Mhm.
vertical object in the city can be doing that. So it could be a shade sail, or it could be a building. We could really
Mhm.
think about
Mhm.
our codes for how we build buildings as part of our shade infrastructure. But unfortunately, most cities don't forefront shade. We've looked at city plans from across the United States and found that shade is it is the least mentioned of all the interventions. And when it is mentioned, it's only mentioned in terms of trees,
Hmm.
usually. That's starting to change. But I think what has happened is because it's not forefronted, what we have in the United States is cities full of shade deserts. So
Yeah.
that means there's just not enough of it. So let's talk about your experience.
Yeah.
You're ducking behind a telephone pole. I mean, that's
Exactly.
a very tiny bit of shade, but you're seeking it out, right? So that tells
Exactly.
me more of it's needed right there.
Yeah. Well, it's what's fascinating is if you look at historic images of Phoenix, and I think it's the same in LA and elsewhere. Before there was mechanical air conditioning,
Mhm,
you would see awnings everywhere,
Yeah.
such that sunlight was not allowed to hit glass, because bad things happen when that happens. The interior of a building heats up. And so we covered the glass or shaded the glass. And you also saw shaded walkways, sidewalks. You
Yeah.
saw canopies in retail areas for people to walk and congregate. Once the ability to cool the air mechanically allowed us to build differently, it's as if we got a little dumber. We
Mm.
forgot the value of the materials that we could be using that would provide a cooler and more shaded environment, because we were able to do it through a completely different means,
Mhm.
which had profound implications for the built environment, something that you study all the time. It's just fascinating to have forgotten something so fundamental.
Yeah, and I had the opportunity to be in Singapore over the summer, which was a fantastic case study in a really hot climate. And since the 1800s, they've had it deeded into the land that every single building is supposed to have these overhangs,
Hmm.
right? And you can see it everywhere you go. They also have massive underground tunnels that are air conditioning,
Right,
so that's
right.
another solution. But yeah, I mean, I think what this is a part of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. We really didn't do ourselves a lot of favor in terms of the climate. Virtually every context that I've examined, whether it is homes or schools or just the built environment in general, has been has made us less climate ready. And that
Hmm.
comes back to that interest in sprawl. If you have a bunch of buildings that are single story and spread apart, you don't have any opportunity to create building shade. And if you disinvest in green stuff, and
Yeah.
don't prioritize it, you're going to have even less of it. So that's why most of our cities are shade deserts, and we over air condition.
So, as an example of heat and the
Mhm.
implications of simply an increasingly warmer planet, you were invited, along with others, to the White House recently, I think in August, to talk about this issue. So, tell us about that convening. What
Mhm.
prompted it?
Mhm. Mhm.
What was the White House expecting to get out of gathering about 100 of you, I believe,
Mhm. Mhm.
together to talk about how you're addressing this issue?
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think the federal government can't ignore this anymore. We've seen this massive uptick in interest in extreme heat just generally across the
Mhm.
board. But there's this realization that communities are not ready. There's no federal program per se around extreme heat. Everything's kind of been ad hoc. And so to me, this convening was the federal government at least acknowledging that we have a problem and something needs to be done. And there was a lot of energy. What I'm taking away, my biggest positive, is there's a lot of energy from local government officials, from private sector, public sector, that want to kind of roll up their sleeves and do something. So that makes me really excited. What was a little bit frustrating is the way that there were no new commitments made
Hmm.
by the federal government in that meeting, financial or otherwise. The only thing that they are committing to do is this OSHA, worker safety protection, which is very necessary at a federal level because we're seeing state pushback on that. But the general message was that we already have invested in climate change. So what we need is to here are these climate investments we have. This is what the DoD is doing. This is what HHS is doing. This is what EPA is doing. These are the grants we have available that communities could be applying for. You should apply for them. And what we need is help figuring out how to get communities to get in the mix. And of course, then what communities say is now we're competing across all these hazards for this already limited climate
Right.
adaptation funds. Yeah, so that was something. And then the other really interesting thing was which agencies, how they articulated their role in
Hmm.
all of this.
Hmm.
And so I know there's a lot of interest right now in FEMA being that entity. FEMA, reading between the lines, is very reticent to be the hazard response uh, entity for heat. They are prepared to do kind of hazard mitigation work, and that's where their emphasis lies. But other departments, this is where the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense seemed really eager to take on some, they were kind of not the usual suspects that come up. But HHS does, they likened it to COVID response, that this
Hmm.
was a public health emergency. And the Department of Defense said, hey, we've got to protect our military, and they're active and in equipment. And this has a lot of analogs to the labor sector.
Well, that's really interesting what you're saying. So as you know, our next 10 Across Summit will be in Jacksonville, and
Mhm.
FEMA will be there
Yeah,
conducting, and I think you'll be there with us,
hopefully.
conducting an exercise about how to establish what the criteria are for a heat emergency and
Right.
a declaration therein. And I assume, per your comments, then
Mhm.
their obligation to respond to it, which would require
Mhm.
some financing and other things. So
Mhm. Mhm.
it does appear that FEMA is stepping up in that regard. And I think NOAA will also
Mhm.
be a participant in that discussion. But we will also have the Department of Defense represented because, in
Mhm.
many ways, their seriousness of purpose they can bring when they want
Mhm.
to the
Mhm.
design of their bases, the management
Mhm.
of the equipment, and obviously the personnel. And I
Yeah.
think we can learn, cities can learn from how some of these bases, which are often as big as cities,
Right.
are trying to equip themselves and
Mhm.
adapt. Um, so, one, we definitely hope you are there because it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Um, so you are working. You have some other grants that you've
Mhm.
assembled with the Luskin Center, where
Mhm.
you are at UCLA, with ASU and U of
Mhm.
A. So talk about the work that you're doing with your fellow researchers
Mhm.
around heat at the moment.
Mhm. Yeah, so at the Luskin Center for Innovation, our specialty, our bread and butter is environmental policy, and we do a lot of engagement with stakeholders from local, county, state, and even federal level. We have a tradition in California, but that's changing because under that, I direct our heat equity research program. It's a portfolio that has grown substantially over the last few years. And the kind of cornerstone of that is our NOAA grant, the Center for Heat Resilient Communities. And in that grant, we've been given seed funding essentially from NOAA through the IRA. And we are going to be working with teams of experts to develop a framework for what a heat resilient community looks like. What are the kind of what is the roadmap to getting to that kind of the goals? What are the funding sources? What are the metrics that they need to follow? What are the cost benefit analysis tools that they might have at their disposal? How can they engage communities and legislatures around this? So all these key issues of the how we're going to do this how-to roadmap. And then we're going to be field testing that with communities over the next 3 years. So cohorts of 10 communities, so a total of 30. And we mean that broadly. So that could be a city like Phoenix.
Mhm.
It could be a rural community. It could be a tribal entity. It could be, have there could be a focus on a school district or a military base, right? We're hoping for variety because
Mm.
the devil's in the details. We can spit out these really generalized approaches for cities, but um, how that plays out really depends on the context. And so we're trying to vet it and make it as thorough as possible. And at the end of the day, here's what we hope. We hope that cities walk away with a shovel ready plan for how to capture the funding that's coming down the line because they are now aligned with all these resources that we know are available at state and federal levels. Um, but we also hope that we have a compelling set of data for the federal government to say, look, communities can't do this alone. They need an injection of funding. They need dedicated heat resources to do this, at least in the short to mid run, right?
Mhm.
And I think you've seen that in Phoenix. We've seen this in LA. Having a chief heat officer, somebody in charge,
Mhm.
is tremendously helpful for at least getting some stuff, some projects off the road and capturing that funding.
Mhm. And as someone who has an urban planning background and thus a keen observer of the built environment, the
Mhm.
places that we make for ourselves, many of which are really not built for us and our bodies, but they're built for automobiles, they're built for other
Mhm.
things. We've put ourselves in a deficit situation to how to make a
Mhm.
community more resilient and responsive to some of these heat issues. I'm thinking of enormous parking lots
Mhm.
in front
Mhm.
of retail centers, the width of our streets,
Yeah.
especially in this area,
Mhm.
which are far wider than they need to be. And we have a community that's being built here in the private sector that doesn't have cars, and the buildings are much closer together, thus self shading and all kinds of things like that. But
Mhm.
when you have a given condition that's already difficult from the start,
Mhm. Mhm.
how do you help those communities? Because these problems are
Mhm.
enormous. I think you're the funding,
Mhm.
it seems rather hard to imagine. So how do you
Mhm.
approach that?
Mhm. Yeah. I have never been more terrified driving than living in Phoenix, and I grew up learning to drive in Boston. So those massive thoroughfares. Yeah, no, that's what you're calling out is exactly the problem. And I think, as a really kind of down concrete example of that, I look at the schools in California, which is an issue that we've looked at quite a bit. Those were mostly designed in the mid-century through the 70s or 80s when we weren't thinking about climate change. And so we have these like single-story buildings that may or may not have air conditioning. They're not designed at all for cooling. And they're surrounded by massive asphalt play yards. And they don't have trees. They systematically push the trees out so the communities may have more trees than the actual schools. So we have put ourselves in a deficit. And now we have a situation in California where we have nearly $10 billion school bond coming up just to play, not even catch up on that issue, to play catch up on the fact that like schools are under-resourced and need a lot of stuff. And so schools are having to be really strategic and think about like, okay, well, maybe we need to upgrade our HVAC, and that's an opportunity to get a heat pump through the IRA funding. I mean, it's like, it's going to take that level of precision to realistically start recouping what you aptly described as we are in a giant hole.
Yeah. And I say that I take no pleasure in making that observation. It's just so obvious that what we built is difficult.
I mean, I think this is a giant hole in terms of something like, okay, so whether it's FEMA or HHS that deals with the emergency, right? There's a cost there. There's tremendous cost. It may not be property damage. But if you think about, like, we know historically that dealing with hazards as just sort of a response type approach hasn't worked very well. We're just basically like wildfire, for instance. That's a ballooning budget, right? So now take something like heat, where we need to do a tremendous amount of mitigation, and then we have the potential for this massive ballooning budget. Do we really have the resources to do that? So I think a kind of taking a big picture view, the mitigation is going to be substantial, and it needs to be baked into things like land use planning.
Yeah.
Basic development.
Exactly. And you know that field, and I think you're well aware of how things come to be the way they are with regard to zoning or market forces for development, a variety of things, and changes at that level, which almost take you back to the legislature, if you will, and what changes you can make at that level. Here's a simple question that's come up, and it's been in circulation for years now. We just saw Helene, the hurricane, move from the Gulf area right through the Trent Cross zone, and then further inland, and obviously incredible devastation ensued. What do you think about the idea of naming heat events and the value of that? There's a certain logic. On the other hand, is Helene and what happened there, because it was named, still going to draw the kind of attention I think we need to bring to these issues? But what about naming very severe heat events?
Well, I mean, attention by whom? Attention by those who need to evacuate. I don't know that people need to evacuate from a heat wave. Perhaps they need to go to a cooling center if they don't have other resources. So that's a whole nother can of worms. Yeah. But the thing about naming, so in California, we are experimenting with a ranking system. Okay. But there's really no evidence that these are going to increase public awareness. What do I mean by that? So hurricanes, it's a legacy naming system. We started naming hurricanes because sea captains didn't want to be bothered to say latitude and longitude over and over again. And they started naming the hurricanes after their wives. And so that was,
that could be a whole other podcast, but we're not going to do that today.
Yes. Yeah. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. Well, I mean, I think this goes to all heat problems. Right now, there's a lot of experimenting that's being done, and we need to be watching what's working and what's not working, and not be afraid to say, we thought this would be a good idea and it wasn't, or we thought this was a good idea, but it's, does no harm, so maybe we'll keep doing it. But I don't think naming, like my personal opinion is, I don't think that naming is going to be the silver bullet for heat waves. And I don't think it is with Helene. I mean, my understanding actually is there have been planning that it's problems with allowing development to happen in places where people are vulnerable.
Right. You're right about heat waves. They're very different. In our case, we've had, I think we're well over 100 days. I know we are of 100-degree temperatures here in the Phoenix area. So this is not like a hurricane, which maybe is named. You see it coming. Eventually, it's not there anymore. We're now experiencing 3, 4, 5 months of continuous heat. So a thought here is, let's imagine the worst of that is happening at the same time. For whatever reason, we have a power outage, and that artificial cooling that we're dependent on to make this place work is suddenly not available to us. So now we really do have a heat emergency. The ability to, and I think you've investigated some of this in your previous research, cooling centers, places where people can go. Should we be, especially where we are, maybe now even in California where you are, which it's getting hotter, not like it is here, but building into our urban cores and other places where we have dense populations who are going to be really needful of a place to go. Do you see enough of that happening?
I actually think that's one of the areas where there's been enthusiasm, and perhaps actually outsized enthusiasm. And I see why. But I mean, okay, so there's a lot of excitement about resilience centers. So this is an improvement from cooling centers, because nobody wants to go to some designated place they don't need to be. So if there's a resilience center, the shift in idea is this is a place where community members might go. There's stuff to do and reasons to be there. It's still asking an individual to upend their day, to leave their home and to go somewhere. And that might not be tenable, with everyone's lifestyle. So finding a way to cool people where they are seems like the best first cut, and focusing on the most vulnerable populations seems like the best way to concentrate those resources. However, I also think that we pay a lot of attention to heat as a hazard. And I think some of these flashy headlines like extreme heat causes more deaths and all other weather related disasters, that has been huge in terms of getting people to understand that this is a big, serious problem, that people are dying. On the same token, I think heat's actually has these hidden and pernicious long-term effects that are going to start rearing their head 10, 20, 30 years from now. And it's because the basic quality of life between the haves and have-nots, that's where heat divides.
Right.
I can, if I live just less than a mile away from a family that doesn't have access to cooling, shade in their neighborhood, good health care, access to their independent car, their heat exposure is very different than mine. And I think the scariest thing, like, it's hard to scare me with heat now because I've been in this world a long time, but the scariest thing I've heard is at one of the many workshops that has popped up, some research coming out of Harvard saying, look, this starts prenatal. We have pregnant women who are exposed to just moderate levels of heat, having preterm births. This changes children and their cognitive abilities over their life course. Then they go to schools and neighborhoods where maybe they can't get good sleep because they don't have air conditioning at home. So they don't go to school, or maybe their schools don't have air conditioning, or they're subject to heat, right? So we're just subtly widening the gap as the climate changes. And I think that's the really sad story that's difficult to tell.
And that parallels so many issues with regard to who has the ability to adjust their behaviors or where they are or their accommodations, and who doesn't, in the face of all kinds of challenges. The ability to run an air conditioner here and the cost of doing so with increased electricity costs is a major factor of concern here in this region, which I think gets right to your point.
There's a really interesting thing that happened last year. By the way, we're in a heat wave again here in October.
I know you are. I know you are. As are we.
I mean, it's going to extend. Saying that there's a heat season, what heat season for some cities like you guys. But last year, there was a particular extreme heat event in which the grid was nearing failure here in Los Angeles. And the government sent out a tweet and said, if you can, turn
Yes.
down your air conditioning. And people did and
Yes.
staved off a grid failure. So that was a
Mhm.
great collective action example.
It was, and very logical. And I think people, they want to do something. With heat,
Yeah.
there's not much you can do. It just is. But if you can adjust your behaviors and when you
Mhm.
use power and other things, I think people want to participate in a
Right.
solution, and that was
Yeah.
a good example of that. So let's close out this conversation because there's been a little disappointment in, for maybe a lot of reasons, but for one, with regard to the current election season and
Right.
debates, that climate change is getting lost and the address to it in
Agreed.
so many other things. For someone who actually started her career watching a legislature, thinking
Mhm.
about government, now you're in policy.
Mhm.
Uh, just the nature of this issue as it meets our political system and the discussions going on. And I'm not looking for you
Mhm.
to say how disappointed you are, just observing why it is the way that it is and why these topics are difficult to bring to the forefront.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, yeah, I mean that's the $1 million question, or maybe not the $1 billion question these
At
days.
least it's probably trillions.
The trillion. Okay, it's the $1 trillion question. Um, what I can say is that I have witnessed with tenure change comes setback, and with this issue, there's not a lot of time for more setback because we're already set back. And it's a difficult. If it's a difficult sometimes we have certain hazards that cause lots of property damage or might have obvious economic loss implications, and those are sadly what pushes the needle. But saying that there are vulnerable people whose quality of life is suffering is not always the most compelling political appeal.
Mhm.
And so I would say, this issue, it extends beyond which party is going to support direct environmental legislation. So at Luskin Center, we take something we call the exposure settings framework. And what that means is we look at the everyday places where people are exposed, because those are where we can see not just like, are there enough trees or really
Mhm.
obvious stuff like that, but we can see the everyday impediments to people's lives that make it really, really difficult for them to not become heat exposed. And so I would say, what if you are an elderly person living in a rural area and your nearest healthcare facility is very, very, very far away, and you are dependent on public transit to get there, and you have long wait times to get there. Or maybe you are dependent on a government sponsored shuttle to get you to that place where you need to get the treatment. Maybe you have a chronic disease like diabetes and
Mhm.
you need to get that right. So while that doesn't seem on its face like a heat problem, any sort of change in political party that has implications for the financing of local social infrastructure does then have implications
Mhm.
for how heat ready a community is going to be able to be. Another great example of that is we've done a lot of work in schools, and it's not just that schools don't have trees or enough, right? So it's like, well, we have things like the American Disability Act, which requires matching funds for schools to do any facilities retrofit. So the federal government requires a 20% match. State of
Mhm.
California used to have a 40% match requirement for any outdoor facilities change. So if you want to do something like put a shade sail over playground equipment, it's not so easy. We've rolled that back since in California, but the federal government still has it. And it's not that that's a bad thing, right? We do want to upgrade our children's play areas
Mhm.
so that all children have access to play, but we don't want it to stand in the way of keeping all children safe from the heat.
Right. Right. Well, I think these are obviously complex issues
Yeah.
filled with all kinds of subtleties. Weaving them into a compelling political dialogue
Mhm.
where these things are taken seriously and don't get
Mhm.
lost in the clutter of all the craziness that goes on, I'm afraid, with politics at the moment, is a real
Mhm.
challenge. And I think you're operating in exactly the right space at the policy level
Mhm.
and the narratives you're trying to build around
Mhm.
this, in addition to the specific solutions that you hope to bring to some of these communities. But as you point out, the solution will be, I think, how well you articulate this to the powers that be to get
Mhm.
them then the resources to be able
Mhm.
to implement. So I really
Yes.
appreciate your work in this regard.
Yeah. And I mean, if I could, this is exactly what we try to do. I mean, this is harder to fund through traditional grants. So we do,
Hmm.
philanthropic fundraising. And we have been very lucky to have a wonderful supporter called the Resources Legacy Fund that has helped us with the articulation work of translating the science into packages that are something that legislators can hear and can use, or packages that the public can hear and can use. And so it's about finding the ways to articulate the problem. One of the things I've been trying to say lately with in California is, rather than say, oh, we need to protect schools and children, say we need to protect immediately 15% of our population 60 hours a week. Does that
Hmm.
play well? I don't know, right? But does that play differently if you stop thinking, oh, kids at school, and you start thinking 15% of our population 60 hours a week is climate ready if we invest just in schools, right?
Hmm.
That's a different way of framing the problem.
Well, again, that's why I appreciate what you're doing, because you're thinking through this and what's going to resonate. Frankly, we wouldn't claim to be the topic experts at Tenor-Cross, but we're trying to build platforms that others can use to help make these cases. And that's why we wanted to reach out to you today. So, Kelly, it's been a real pleasure. I look
Yeah.
forward to seeing you in Jacksonville when we'll be meeting
Yes.
with FEMA to talk about what we can do to establish the criteria for heat emergencies and just the basic work that needs to be done. So, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I would encourage any community that's listening to this podcast that's interested in becoming one of our heat resilient communities to look at heat.gov. We're going to start recruiting communities at the end of the month, end of October, and we're going to have this program going on. So please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about that.
And we'll put that in the show notes and any links that you want people to have access to and promote the availability of participating in this program. So we'd be thrilled to be able to do that. So thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.